Many people have asked over the centuries the question, what is the meaning of life? Anybody in here ever asked that question yourself? Don't be ashamed to admit it. Let's a show of hands. Honestly, anybody asked, what is the meaning of life? The rest of you are liars because you didn't put your hands up. It's an age-old, from the very beginning, we've asked that question, humanity has. What is the meaning of life? And in particular, how can a God who is so far beyond us, who is so much more magnificent than we are, actually stoop to loving humanity? Why would God do that? And I think, honestly, with the rise of modern science, something which I'm a fan of, and I know others in this room are as well, like Jim, love to get into the science, the different discoveries in science. But in all honesty, with things like the Hubble telescope, reaching for the stars, landing on the moon, and all these things, in some ways has only made that question even more pertinent and even more magnified. The fact that we are now measuring the distance between galaxies, that we're measuring the expanse of the universe, only makes that a little bit even more difficult, I would say. Anybody ever seen the 1990, I think it's the end of the 90s, like 97, 98, the movie Contact? Anybody seen that movie? Remember it? There's an opening sequence in that movie that I want to show. It's just a couple minutes long, but and obviously it's all computer, generated, but it begins to show the expanse of our universe. So if you would roll that for me, Dan. Let's watch this for a moment. I think. See, this is why I hesitated putting it in, Dan. We talked about this a lot, and I told him I went back and forth because I feared this. Jesus says in chapter 10, do not be afraid, but I was. I think it's going. Yeah, it looks like it's going now. Yeah, we could turn out the lights. Can't turn off the sun, Lacey. That's not going to work. So you see Earth begin to recede as we go past Mars. Earth is no longer visible. Mars is gone. There comes Jupiter. But even with as big as Jupiter is in our own solar system, it too begins to fade very quickly as we go past Saturn. And out to the farthest reaches of our solar system, where the rest of the planets can't even be distinguished any longer. As we leave our solar system and head out further into our galaxy, the Milky Way, and of course, our star is still visible, but none of our planets. As we reach other stars, and quickly our star fades from view, as we leave a nebula and go again through our galaxy. You just see the scope and the size of the universe that God has made. And that question of, are we valuable? Why are we valuable? To me, comes into view. And as we leave our galaxy, the Milky Way, you begin to see other galaxies more clearly. And now our spot in our galaxy is no longer distinguishable as we fly past others. And then we see just even a tiny blip of our universe, which contains so many thousands of galaxies itself. It's quite a remarkable little opening video, isn't it? And it enhances that idea of, who are we? Who are we in this vast universe? And the truth is, I'm not really sure that I have a great, answer or explanation for that. I don't know that I can pinpoint why God chose to create us or even chooses to love us in spite of our failures, but it happened, and He continues to love us. And in moments like this, I'm reminded of a psalm that Lyle shared with us at our men's breakfast this month, Psalm 8. If you want to turn there, you can read that with me, or you could just listen. It's a beautiful psalm. And my guess is Lyle was probably thinking of it as we watched that. I think you said it's your favorite, right, Lyle? Is that what you said? Yeah. A psalm of David. O Lord, our Lord, your majestic name fills the earth. Your glory is higher than the heavens. You have taught children and infants to tell of your strength, silencing your enemies and all who oppose you. When I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, and they would have been able to see that a lot better than we can. The moon and the stars you set in place. What are mere mortals that you should think about them? Human beings that you should care for them. Yet you made them only a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them charge of everything you made, putting all things under your authority. The flocks and the herds and all the wild animals, the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, and everything that swims the ocean currents. O Lord, our Lord, your majestic name fills the earth. It's a beautiful psalm. And I love in the midst of it, what's the question that David asks? What are we that you think about us, that you care about us? Because of passages like this, I believe and trust that God does care very deeply for us. I trust and believe that God wants the best for us, for me, even if I can't see it or understand it. I believe and trust as a disciple of the man named Jesus because He considers us valuable. And so I want to read from Matthew chapter 10 and 11, our text for this week. Starting in verse 28 of Matthew chapter 10, let's read together. Jesus says, "Don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot touch your soul. Fear only God, who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. What is the price of 2 sparrows? 1 copper coin? But not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. Everyone who acknowledges me publicly here on earth, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But everyone who denies me here on earth, I will also deny before my Father in heaven. Don't imagine that I came to bring peace to the earth. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies will be right in your own household. If you love your father or mother more than you love me, you are not worthy of being mine. You are not worthy of being mine. Or if you love your son or daughter more than me, you are not worthy of being mine. If you refuse to take up your cross and follow me, you are not worthy of being mine. If you cling to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for me, you will find it." And then in chapter 11, down in verse 28, and Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." So let's talk about discipleship for a few minutes. Discipleship demands a decision. a part of this, though, we have to talk about the value of being God's. Jesus says it here that we're more valuable than a sparrow, and I've given you a picture of a sparrow up on the screen. It should come as no surprise for those of us who have been in church, who call ourselves Christians, to believe and to say the words that He finds us valuable, that God looks at us and sees that we have worth and value to us. And even that God would value us over other creatures, over other animals that we see and experience on this earth. And as we just discussed a few moments ago, this statement by Jesus about our value, I think, is really important. That God would invest value into us cannot be overstated, especially when we take into view this expansive and vast universe. Billions of stars and galaxies, and God looks at us and chooses to love us and find value in us. Finding meaning in life is the pursuit of all people. Unfortunately, there are many people who never end up finding it, or who maybe find it and then choose to reject it, to throw it away for something different. But we have an obligation as God's people, and we're going to talk about this more in just a minute, but we have an obligation to ensure that we don't lose sight of that meaning and that value in our lives. That's what makes the taking of any life in Scripture so valuable and so lasting an act, even taking the life of animals. Because the life we see all around us was created by the same God. The animals that walk this earth with us, created by the same God who created us through Jesus. And so we have to understand and take life as a precious, precious thing. And of course, this is no more clear or certain than with other human beings. And so we have to do everything we can as God's people to honor life, to value life, and to consider it worthy the same way that God looks at us, as sinful and as terrible as we are at times. To me, that's why sin against each other is bad. You know, something like adultery. Adultery isn't bad because it's about sex. That's not what makes adultery bad. Sex isn't inherently sinful or bad. What makes adultery bad is because it doesn't value somebody else. It doesn't see the worth and the value in them that they inherently have. Same with stealing. Stealing isn't bad because you want something else. It's okay to want some things. It's okay to need some things. Stealing is bad because what you're saying about the other person is they're not worthy to have that thing that I want. It's dehumanizing. It's degrading to each other to not consider other people as worthy or as valuable as we are. And by doing that, we don't consider people, we don't give them the value that God places upon us. And we could go on with other examples of sin, but the fundamental truth is that God values all people more than anything else, and we have to take that seriously as disciples. That value has to come into place as we live our lives for God. But then there's a decision that a disciple has to make. Verses 32 and 33 of chapter 10, I think, lay out the gravity of that obligation in obedience and faithfulness. Look back at 32 and 33. What does Jesus say? He says, "Everyone who acknowledges me publicly here on earth, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven." Great. Stop there, Jesus, and don't say any more. I'm cool with that. But then he goes on in verse 33, and he says, "But everyone who denies me here on earth, I will also deny before my Father in heaven." Okay, now it's gotten real. Now he's shown us both the positive and the negative side of this coin. And if you think about, many in this first century that Jesus is talking to, and the earliest disciples who are reading Matthew's gospel, think about what they were enduring at the hands of those who didn't want Christianity spread. We think about the Jews in the synagogues and in the temple who were fighting against, maybe we look at somebody like Saul, who were fighting against Christians in the earliest stages, and something like this becomes all the more important to those Christians. Most of us, I don't think, connect with the weight of this statement by Jesus. But those Jews who decided to leave the synagogues, who decided to leave the temple and the worship that was happening there, they absolutely made a very life-altering choice to follow this condemned man, Jesus, who died upon a cross. They chose to follow him, and in doing so, they had a whole lot to lose. Most of us, when we became Christians, when we gave our lives to God, didn't lose a whole lot in the process. I grew up in church. So when I was 10 or 11, I think 10. It's so long ago, who knows now? I think I was 10. When I decided to give my life, to dedicate my life to God, my parents were excited. My parents weren't against me in that. My brothers weren't against me in that. Everybody was excited on my behalf. Not so with the people who were first reading this gospel. And the truth is, not so with many people around the world who are still giving their lives to Jesus. There are many in this world who are becoming disciples who do have a lot to lose, who are, in essence, losing their families in the process. Their fathers and mothers are against them. Their brothers and sisters are against them making this choice. There is still a lot to lose for people coming to Jesus. But it doesn't necessarily land for us as much as it might for them. Verses 34 through 39 reinforce that Jesus' kingship demands a decision, though. The meaning and value we acknowledge about our lives and all other human beings is found in Jesus and by what He did. And so our discipleship to Him means that we have to take that seriously as we can, and let nothing get in the way of our obligation to Him, not even our family. So what does Jesus mean in these verses, in 34 through 39, where He says, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. I came to pit father and son against each other, mother and daughter, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law. Well, we all get that one, right? That one's obvious to us. What's going on? How are we supposed to understand what Jesus is saying here? And some have gone so far as to say that Christians ought not to have any family ties because of this. In other words, just neglect your family in light of what Jesus says. Well, I don't think that's at all what Jesus is saying here. Of course, this is about priority, right? The sword Jesus is talking about bringing isn't a physical sword, right? He's not literally holding up a sword to His disciples and saying, I'm ready to cut you if you don't do what I say. No, the sword is a metaphor, right? That a relationship with Him, His call on our lives, demands a choice. It demands a decision. And that decision can have extreme ramifications, going so far as to pit you against your own family, if that's what it comes to. But a disciple has to make that choice. Is Jesus my priority, or is my family and my job, something else in this life, a higher priority? And we've seen this all along in Matthew. He keeps bringing this up. Back in the Sermon on the Mount, He talked about you cannot serve two gods, right? You cannot serve two masters. Hate the one and be devoted to the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You remember that? All along, Matthew is showing us the call from Jesus to discipleship. And he presents it in all these different ways. Jesus is trying to make clear. As we read Matthew's gospel, you can't help, I think, but see that Jesus is trying to make clear that following Him means giving up certain things in your life. It means wholeheartedly being devoted to Jesus, putting Him at the top of every priority list we could make. That if you're going to, sit down with your spouse or your kids or just yourself and write out a priority list of what matters in your life, if Jesus isn't at the top of that, then your priority list is wrong. That's what He's trying to communicate to us. That's the sword He's bringing, to excise those things in our lives that would come before Him. And then in verses 38 and 39, He says, if you refuse to take up your cross and follow me, you are not worthy of being mine. If you cling to your life, you will lose it. If you give up your life for me, you will find it. It's interesting, verse 38 has, in essence, been a little co-opted. You might have heard this. You might have heard Christians say this, that somebody who may not have as much money as the person next to him, well, that's just That's just my cross to bear. God made me poor. That's my cross to bear. Or I'm not as good looking as my neighbor. Wow, that's my cross to bear. Can we please quit co-opting this really important statement that Jesus is making? That's not a cross to bear. That's an inconvenience. Not having as much money as the person next to you, that's an inconvenience. Not being as pretty as your neighbor is simply an inconvenience. It's not a cross to bear. The only cross to bear is the cross that leads to death. See, we've come to take crosses as being these cute little gold things that we wear around our necks and go, yep, I'm a Christian. You see the cross? That's a symbol of torture and death in the first century. And so the message that Jesus is sending to his disciples isn't, hey, when you have enough money, buy a gold cross and wear it around your neck. That's not bearing your cross. Picking up and bearing your cross is following Jesus to the cross, to death. Being willing to sacrifice even your life for the sake of the gospel. And of course, we know how this plays out later in Matthew, right? Jesus is laying the groundwork for the disciples' failure, right? Here he's speaking to his disciples and saying that unless you pick up your cross and follow me, you are forsaking your decision to follow me. But they don't get it, do they? Because later on in Matthew, as we're going to see, as Jesus goes to the cross, where are the disciples? They scatter to the four winds, right? They don't follow him to the cross. They forsake their calling. I pray that it would not be so with us. That if our call is to death on Jesus' behalf, that we would gladly pick up our cross and follow him. I want to close by talking about rest. Some of you are doing that right now. It's okay. I'm okay if you're resting. It's good. It's good to rest, and that's what I want to talk about. What is Jesus saying in chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, where he says, "Come to me, all who are weary, and who are bearing heavy burdens. I will give my rest to you." It was a common saying in Jesus' day among Pharisees and among other teachers that they should carry the yoke of the law, the yoke of Torah. What did that mean, to carry the yoke of Torah? Well, one, we know that a yoke is something that an oxen would carry between them, right? That would bind two oxen together so that they can walk together and plow a field or do other kind of work. Yoke is a heavy burden to bear. So the Pharisees took up this metaphor and applied it to bearing the yoke of Torah. Well, Torah in Hebrew simply means command or law or instruction, something like that. And so what the Pharisees mean is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of Moses, the things that they held up as the pinnacle of Hebrew Scriptures, they said that is the yoke to bear. But then they went a little bit further than that, and they began to commentate on the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. We know this from historical documents, that they wrote down commentary. What does it mean to follow the law? So they began to have questions and debates, and we see this in the commentaries, that they're debating each other in these commentaries. Because one rabbi or one Pharisee, one teacher may say, well, not working on the Sabbath has to mean that you can only go so far, right? You can only walk so far in a day. So one rabbi might say, well, 3 miles, that's it. You have to limit your walking to 3 miles, because past 3 miles, you're working. So you can only walk up to 3 miles. Another rabbi might say, no, 5 miles is probably more appropriate. After 5 miles, it becomes work. Well, what about 10 miles? Or you see the questions that they could begin to ask. And so they begin to debate and to commentate on God's Word, which I think is an appropriate thing to do. But then they took that, their commentary, and they added that to the yoke of Torah. And so it became this heavy and weighty matter, because what they asked of the people, of just regular everyday fishermen and farmers and stonemasons and all other kinds of people, is you have to know everything that's in the law and in the commentaries, and you have to keep up with that and to do what we tell you to do. And so the yoke they placed on people It was very weighty indeed. So Jesus comes along and he offers a different yoke. He said his yoke is easy. It's easy because it's a yoke of mercy and love. Not a yoke of instruction and command, but a yoke of mercy and love. And that is an easy yoke to bear. And I think it's in this sense that we understand that his yoke is easy and his burden light. For no one should dare ever speak that Jesus doesn't care for those who follow him. Whereas it might be said of the Pharisees that their intent maybe wasn't so geared toward the people, but more toward the law, the instruction. Whereas I think Jesus was toward his people. And so he offers them rest. Let's talk about rest for a moment. Because the one who submits to Jesus' yoke, who allows this yoke to be placed upon him or herself, will find rest in the Spirit. So what rest is Jesus talking about? Well, just going to guess that most of us in this room feel tired a lot of the time. Is that safe to say? You feel tired a lot? You don't feel rested. Maybe you wake up and you feel like you haven't quite gotten enough sleep. But then maybe the next night you get more sleep and you still wake up and you go, man, I still don't feel completely rested. Anybody in here share in that with me? I don't think it's a stretch to say that our very fast-paced modern world has us running around senseless in it a lot of the time. And so what rest does Jesus offer us here? Is it merely physical rest at the end of a long day? Is that what he's offering? That when you lay your head down upon your pillow and you go to sleep, that at night you're going to get good rest. You'll wake up the next morning and feel completely refreshed. Well, if you've lived even more than a day, you know that's not true. That is not the rest that Jesus is offering, right? Because, again, we wake up and we don't feel rested. So obviously he doesn't mean that. So he has to mean, I think, he has to be talking about rest in his kingdom. And ultimately, we find rest in the God who allows us to become part of his kingdom. And that is part of being his disciple. But why should Jesus offer us that? What good does that do us now? Well, think about, okay, so we're in the long winter months right now, yes? Yes, we're in the long winter months. Anybody ready for winter to be over, for spring to come, the flowers to bloom? Yep, a bunch of you. Put your hands down. It's wintertime. Enjoy it. Is it not true that we enjoy spring and summer more because we endure a long winter? When I was growing up in Texas, I don't like hot weather. I just hate it. And, I say that and people go, but you grew up in Texas. Shouldn't you be used to it? No. You never get used to 110 degrees. You just don't. It doesn't happen. You learn to endure and bear it. I would long for autumn. I would wait expectantly for winter to come for just a couple of months, because that's all we get there. Like 2 days, really. Just a little bit of reprieve from the hot weather. And up here in the north, I feel like that's the way that most people up here who grew up here feel about summer and spring and summer here. We endure a long winter for just a little bit of that reprieve. But doesn't that make spring all the more special? I think that's how we need to look at the rest that Jesus is offering us in his kingdom. This life is hard. And it's long. I'm not going to agree with what I think it was Nick said earlier, that most of us are close to the grave. I'm not going to agree with that. It's okay, Nick. Life is long and hard at times, isn't it? We feel frustrated. We feel beat up. Maybe like we don't know what to do next. And then we remember that rest that Jesus offers in his kingdom. And it provides us with hope, knowing that in the end, Jesus wins. Things are going to work out the way that he wants them to work out. And that we will be at rest then. So like we experience the winters and await spring and summer here, so we await that rest that he offers and provides in his kingdom. And that doesn't necessarily help us now physically, right? We still feel run down. We still feel tired. We still feel like we're chickens running around with our heads cut off, and just in the craziness of life. But it helps us to appreciate what's happening now, I think. Knowing what's coming for us, what we will one day receive, that rest that only He can offer. And so to conclude today, thinking about discipleship, the first question is, have you found your value in being God's? Or are you still trying to find value in your life in something that ultimately won't fulfill? I think about a book like Ecclesiastes. Anybody who's read that? Gail's like, yes, I have. What does the teacher in Ecclesiastes say over and over again? I chased after this, but what was it? Vanity. A puff of smoke. It was nothing. Nothing could satisfy. Most of us understand that, right? But guys, there are a lot of people in our world, in our city, who are chasing all kinds of different things. All kinds of different things to satisfy and fulfill their lives. And there's only one place that they're truly going to find fulfillment and rest, and that's in Jesus. And so as disciples, our message to them has to be, come to Him. Stop looking for fulfillment somewhere else. But that has to start with us. If you yourself haven't found fulfillment in Jesus, your value in being God's, then how are you going to communicate that to them? The second thing, have you made a decision to be Jesus' disciple? Sometimes we think this is a one-time decision. I got baptized, I'm good, I'm done. But an everyday decision this has to be. Or are you hiding from this? Not wearing it proudly? Well, Jesus has something to say about that in chapter 10, doesn't He? That those who deny me before others, He will deny before His Father. I don't think that's a position any of us want to be in. We need to think through that. What does that mean for us? And then the last thing to take from today, are there ways now that you can begin to experience the rest that Jesus offers His disciples? Yes, it's coming ultimately when His kingdom is fully come to reign in this world. But are there ways now that we can begin to experience that rest? I believe that there are. Through prayer, through silence and solitude. Those of us with little kids at home don't get that a lot, but for those of you that don't have little kids at home, seek out the silence and solitude that I can't have. I want you to feel blessed that you can do that on my behalf, because I don't get it. So you take it. Begin to experience that rest now. That comfort, that knowledge that Jesus is taking care of our lives. I wrote about the burden of weariness this morning in my bulletin article. It just happened to line up perfectly with what I was going to talk about today. Let Jesus take away that weariness. You'll feel better. You'll experience life better if you can do that. And that can be a difficult thing to do, but a necessary thing. So we're His disciples. We've made that choice, but it demands something of us. It has to mean something to us. And so this morning, we're going to have an opportunity for you to let us know if we can help you out. If we can help you experience that rest this morning. If you need to just ask this church for prayers, or come and dedicate your life to God in a new way this morning. We're here for you for that. We have that opportunity this morning as we stand and as we sing.